Welcome back to You Go History with Joe and Giorlando. In today's video, we are going back to September 2009, but I like to refer to as Lightsworn Zombie format, and taking a look at the Lightsworn Zombie Hybrid. Yeah, so today we're actually going to combine these two popular strategies into one. As this format evolved, it may have originally started where Lightsworns and zombie-based strategies were either those that incorporated Krebon / Emergency Teleport or Deep Sea Diva into a format that by the very end, a lot of players were just looking at these powerful cards, Allure of Darkness, Burial from a Different Dimension, the zombie cards, Bryanek, obviously the Lightsworn package, Charge of the Light Brand, just combining them together. So today we're going to actually look at a hybrid zombie Lightsworn deck, not the one that incorporates Phantom of Chaos and Sky Scourge and Nalaris. We may eventually profile that strategy, but instead one that has a very singleton-based, with a couple doubles, Lightsworn package to incorporate Judgment Dragon with a sufficient quantity of names, but then also the same type of zombie package that you would typically see in those Deep Sea Diva / Krebons based strategies. This deck is incredibly explosive, though needs to cut cards along the way. We're not going to see Honest and some of the other really popular inclusions in Lightsworn based strategies. No Beckoning Light, for example. So it's going to be a Lightsworn strategy inherently, because it's going to have Charge, Recharge, and then of course Judgment Dragon, a variety of Lightsworn monsters, but then also that ability to take the explosive nature of the zombie package with the newly released Bryanek and swiftly OTK the opponent. This was a format where Lightsworn's zombies and then the eventual hybrid variations were incredibly popular, but there were still other decks around the fringes. Blackwings, for example, Gladiator Beasts occasionally, and then even some strategies involving Dimensional Alchemist. But nevertheless, let's jump back into the zombie Lightsworn format and actually look at a hybrid of them both. All right, we'll start the deck profile off with the boss monster. So, believe it or not every version of this deck actually played Judgment Dragon. There's a variation of this deck that cut back on the variety of Lightsworn names in exchange to maximize the most efficient Lightsworn names. I elected to profile this deck with 2 Judgment Dragons because I kind of like the idea of having a deck that has 2 Judgment Dragons, 2 Chaos Sorcerers, and a Dark-Armed Dragon as the boss monsters. But believe it or not every version of this particular strategy, the zombie Lightsworn strategy, actually played Judgment Dragons, though almost all of them did elect to play at least the Chaos Sorcerer Dark-Armed Dragon package. If we look at some of the variations of this deck that elected to play other cards, one of the cards that actually saw a little bit of play was Sky Scourge Nalaris with Phantom of Chaos. I might eventually profile that variation, or just elect to play cards like maybe Tragodia in the spot instead. Or Caius, actually. Caius is another good inclusion where, because this variation of the deck is going to play Mizuki, Goblin Zombie, cards like Caius slot in really well because those have always traditionally slotted in really well with what the zombie cards are trying to do. But nevertheless, we've got sort of 5 inherent boss monsters plus a copy of Gorz. Gorz, a dark monster for Dark-Armed Dragon, Chaos Sorcerer. It's also one of the cards that can stop some of the aggressive plays, which obviously this format with decks like Lightsworns can do. It also does a decent job counteracting the Bryanek OTK lines through zombies. Then we have 3 copies of Necrogardna. I've elected to show the Necrogardnas off early in the deck profile because the fact that they are dark combine really well with the 2 copies of Chaos Sorcerer and Dark-Armed Dragon. Not every variation of this deck actually played 3, but I think it's important to play 3 because it gives you an additional target for Burial from a Different Dimension. That's actually a high value return from the Banish pile to the graveyard. For the Lightsworns, we have 2 copies of Lila, 2 copies of Raiko, and then what's going to make this deck quite a bit different than the actual Lightsworn deck that I profiled. Granted, the Lightsworn deck was from the prior format. This deck didn't really see a lot of limitations, so you can compare that Dark Strike Fighter variation to this one quite well. But what's going to make this deck quite a bit different is, in my hand right now are a bunch of one-of Lightsworns on purpose. So this deck, because it has to play the zombie package, needed to cut in some areas. And what this deck elected to do was to maximize the names of the Lightsworn so you can still play Judgment Dragon, but actually cut back on the overall quantity of Lightsworns in the deck. So we've got 1 copy of Wolf, 1 Celestia, 1 Lumina, 1 Jane, and 1 Erin, which were considered sort of the most generic Lightsworns. You'll notice there's no Groth, which is a card that typically combines very well with Lumina, but this deck willingly choosing to play 1 Lumina, might I add. Again, this card is at 3 during the format. You can't really afford to play Groth because you're not utilizing it with Lumina very much. And from there, when you look at some of the additional Lightsworn names, there really are none that really compare. As a result, we're going to play basically a bunch of 1-ofs and then 2 Raikos and 2 Lilas. These are sort of the generic best Lightsworns because they are inherent 1-for-1s, at least in some capacity. Plus, obviously, the milling effect is really important. Raiko's an interesting one because it creates the scenario where your opponent doesn't know if you have Raiko set or perhaps some of the zombie cards, which are 2 copies of Goblin Zombie, 2 copies of Mizuki, one Plague Spreader zombie, and then one Zombie Master. So this is the zombie package that you would see in either this strategy that we're profiling now, or the Diva/Krebons based zombie strategies that were popular during the format. I've profiled Diva zombies on this channel already. Those of you that play modern day Edison, you might be familiar with the nature of Deep Sea Diva with some of these cards, but this was actually the format prior to Edison when you could play 2 copies of Mizuki. That made it, if you combined these cards of Deep Sea Diva and Bryanak, you could actually go through 2 Mizuki iterations and outright OTK. With this specific strategy, obviously the combination of Lightsworn monsters that mill, the value that they provide, the value that Necrogardens provide in their mill, plus some of the boss monsters, makes this a strategy that can kind of combine the explosiveness of the zombie package, because this deck can still do some of those Bryanak OTKs, with the inherent power of the Lightsworn monsters, with boss monsters that the actual zombie deck didn't necessarily get access to per se. Obviously, they had cards like Caius, Dark-Armed Dragon, but this deck gets to maximize Chaos Sorcerer and Judgment Dragon in combination with the already powerful zombie package. So that is our monster count. You'll notice, because it's worth talking about this, there's no Honest in this deck, right? This deck has light monsters. It's sort of that middle row across, but it's not nearly enough, and you're not necessarily protecting Luminas and Lilas on the opening turn because you have the defensive capability of setting some of the zombie cards, plus we're playing more Raikos than we saw in some of the previous versions of this deck. So a little bit of a different variation. Cutting cards like Lightsworn names, Honests, and that way we can incorporate a little bit of the Dark package plus the zombie package. Next, we'll go to the spells. It's really the spells that made these particular strategies so potent back in the day. If you watch the original Lightsworn deck profile, I commented on the power of Charge of the Light Brigade and Solar Recharge. We are at a point where we can still play the full 3 copies of Charge and the full copies of Solar Recharge. So, of course, we're going to maximize all 6 copies of these. You know, the ability to play Charge, mill names, tutor out the Lightsworn that you need, but then also get incremental advantage through Necrogarden and Mizuki, Plague Spreader Zombie, and then just putting lights and darks in the graveyard is obviously huge. This deck gets to play 2 copies of Burial, which isn't a card you necessarily saw in a bunch of actual Lightsworn strategies, but you have obviously the 3 Necrogardenas, the 2 Mizukis, and the Plague, which makes it so that Burial can be a huge impact card. Imagine putting back a bunch of Mizukis and a Necrogardena, so now you get the defensive Necrogardena back into the graveyard. The Mizukis themselves are huge advantage pieces, so the Burial from the Different Dimension was a huge facet of this particular format in Zombies, and now, of course, in this sort of hybrid strategy. I've elected to play 2 copies of Foolish Burial. Foolish Burial is a card that can get Mizuki into the graveyard, Plague into the graveyard, Necrogarden into the graveyard, Wolf into the graveyard technically, even though you only have 1 Celestia, so it's not like you're necessarily combining those 2 as much, or any of the pieces that you might not otherwise have. So light or dark for Sork, the 3rd dark for Dark Arm, even potentially putting the 4th name for Judgment Dragon, which again, in a deck like this that's cutting back on the actual Lightsworn count, you might sometimes need to do that. I also elected to play 1 copy of Monster Reincarnation. Unlike the traditional Lightsworn strategies during this time period, there are no Beckoning Lights in the deck. So if you mill Judgment Dragon, and then in this case, we can, because we have Monster Reincarnation, target Sork and Dark Arm, if you mill any of those cards, you technically don't have a reliable way to get it back if you don't play Reincarnation. I could totally see cutting it. It's not a necessity. In a deck that you're milling, it's not like you're going to see Reincarnation every game, but it is one of those cards that does allow you to manipulate your graveyard a little bit. It also works pretty well with Dark Arm, because sometimes you can just pick a dark out of the graveyard. So if you have 4 darks in the graveyard, especially in a deck with Sork already, you can manipulate the count of darks quite easily. Same is true to an extent with Burial. In a little bit of a different way, you can put darks back into the graveyard if you were under the 3. And then 1 copy of Heavy Storm, because obviously we're going to play Heavy Storm. This format, although Lightsworns is a very popular deck, and this card's not traditionally great against Lightsworns, you'd be surprised. Some of the Lightsworn trades actually played defensive traps. And then, of course, against decks like Zombies, Blackwings, Gladiator Beast, decks that have Royal Oppression, well, we want cards like Heavy Storm. And then to kind of piggyback on what I just said about the Heavy Storm, this deck is actually going to elect to play a handful of trap cards, which was more common than you might anticipate. These cards seem a little bit out of place in Lightsworn, but this is a format where, you know, getting rid of your opponent's sure that they summon can be pretty beneficial. Playing against decks like Zombies, it can be pretty decent to activate this card when your opponent summons a Bryanak. It can be okay. They can still use the OTK through there, but it's not necessarily the worst to have some defensive cards. Plus, this deck doesn't play Honest, so incorporating more defensive cards can be beneficial. So we play 2 Bottomless Trap Holes, a Torrential. Torrential works really well with Goblin Zombie, Mizuki, those type of effects. And then a single copy of Trap Dust Chute, because it was legal during this format, arguably one of the best cards of all time. This card is especially useful in this particular format because you can target your opponent, not target, but you can select your opponent's Tragodia in hand or Gores. And this format, Tragodia was very popular, so sometimes people play 2, even 3 copies of Tragodia. You'll see that when I get to the side deck momentarily. So you can be able to draw this, set it, and then target a a particular battle phase where you intend on going for game, taking a look at your opponent's hand and clearing away any Tragodias can be really game-breaking. So Trap Dust Shoot, obviously a really powerful card, but inherently is more useful in a format where cards like Gores and Tragodia were popular. In terms of the extra deck, all right, we'll start with Mistram. Mistram was one of the newer synchro monsters that you could play during this format. It was released with both Bryanak and Cataster. This deck can manipulate levels quite easily with Lumina, and to a lesser extent, the zombie package inherently, particularly in the mirror match where you can steal your opponent's zombies, you can sometimes manipulate levels, especially if they play Spirit Reaper. Spirit Reaper's level 3 can kind of make that happen. Then we have either a Darkened Dragon if you want to play with prize cards, though this was an incredibly expensive prize card during the format. If you want to go back and play, relative to maybe what most players are using, you can replace that easily with a Thought Ruler Archfiend, which was somewhat popular during the format. Other level 8s, we've got Red Dragon Archfiend, Colossal, which you could also bump up instead of playing the Thought Ruler, a couple copies of Stardust Dragon. This deck can actually make double Stardust when you have Chaos Sorcerers. It's not overwhelmingly likely, but it is plausible. Plus, you can actually just go through zombie iterations and put 2 on the field, so it's not impossible, especially with Burial to go into 2. And this was a point where this card was still perceived as one of the better synchro monsters that we had access to. 1 copy of Black Rose Dragon, which you can definitely manipulate the levels to reach. And then the most important level, really in the entire format, whether it was with this deck or any deck that had Plague Spreader in the zombie package, was level 6. During this format, Bryanak was printed, which totally revolutionized the zombie strategy because the ability to search a Mizuki off Goblin Zombie, immediately discard the Mizuki, and then revive something was obviously incredibly game-breaking, especially if Plague was the monster used to summon Bryanak, because now Plague is in the grave, Mizuki's in your hand, Goblin Zombie's in the grave, and then you can go into another level 6 or maybe level up to 8. So 2 copies of Bryanak make it so that you can access multiple copies over the course of the game. It's unlike formats where it was limited to 1, so the first one can be used to kind of bait, and then the second one can be used to OTK. It's very easy to use that card with the zombie package to actually OTK, which is one of the appeals of the strategy. We have 2 copies of Doom Kaiser Dragon. This card was one of the most important cards in the format because it allows you to steal zombies from your opponent's graveyard. It's actually one of the inherent reasons to maybe potentially not play this variation of the deck, because all of a sudden in the zombie matchups, or even the mirror match to an extent, having access to this card opens the door for both players to really abuse your opponent, especially in this deck when you can mill cards during the end phase and not necessarily have control over whether or not they stay there. At least sometimes when you played the mirror match, you could use Mizuki at certain points to get rid of some of the zombies from your graveyard, or just immediately use Plague the second it gets in the grave. That was one of the cardinal sins of the format, is leaving Plague in your grave, because if you left Plague, your opponent could start summoning multiple copies of Doomkaiser and just keep taking your Plague, and because that's the tuner that is used for basically everything in the deck, your opponent can just keep using it during the course of their turn, and then take so much advantage they might just outright win the game. In this deck, there was the inherent disadvantage of milling Plague during the end phase, though that was technically an issue with all Lightsworn strategies, because even if you're not playing the zombies, you're still going to play Plague because it's really powerful. But it's really important to note the existence of this card makes the existence of Plague in every deck a pretty unique facet of how the format played out. And then 1 copy of Revive King to kind of go along with the Doom Kaiser as the specific Plague Spreader synchro monsters. We have 1 copy of Goyo because it's obviously Goyo Guardian. And then we have 1 copy of Tempest Magician. Tempest can be special summoned by utilizing a level 2 tuner plus a spellcaster like Lila, which this deck does in fact run. It allows you to ditch cards from your hand while dealing damage. So it's similar to Bryanak, though it is a way that you can technically deal damage close to time or just outright take the damage necessary to win the game through its effect. It's a card that was one of my favorite cards during the formats in which you could play it, because some people actually just outright didn't play it, and I don't know why, because it's an extra deck card in a format where the extra deck was pretty spacious, but it's one of the cards that steal games out of nowhere. And then we have 1 copy of Cataster as our singleton level 5. 1 card you could also consider playing is Armor Arm, because this deck does play multiple copies of Raikou, but you can make that decision whether it's a Thought Ruler, Dark End if you want to play with prize cards, or maybe potentially Armor Arm there. That is our extra deck. In terms of the decks that you can anticipate playing against, so of course we have zombie strategies, whether that's with Krebons, with Deep Sea Diva, and I'm talking about the sort of control-based variations, not these hybrid decks. We have Black Wings, which is quite popular. We have Gladiator Beasts. I'm putting in a Lure down to represent Twilight-based decks / sort of Dimensional Alchemist-based decks. There were some interesting strategies that combine obviously light and dark monsters. That's what Twilight means. This deck is sort of trending in that direction, but I call this sort of the hybrid zombie Lightsworn deck as opposed to actual Twilight. I will profile Twilight that has light and dark monsters without the zombie package eventually. We have straight Lightsworn decks. I put Arcus here because Arcus is the epitome of a card that you would only really play in actual full-blown committed Lightsworn decks. It's not really a card that you'd play in these hybrid strategies. I have a Phantom of Chaos to represent the deck that won the SJC that took place in Nashville. that incorporated Sky Scourge and Alaris into the zombie-based strategy. Maybe we'll eventually profile that, but there was definitely this card on the fringes of some strategies. And then if we actually talk about the very end of the format, cards like X-Sabers were released. Now, the X-Saber deck that was released is nowhere near the X-Saber deck that was popular the following year during the sort of the national season when Dark Soul was released, but it was a strategy that had Fall Troll, Saber Hole, even Saber Slash, Emmer's Blade, Airbellum. It was sort of the framework of the type of X-Saber decks that you would see at SJC Edison. It was on the fringes, but it did actually place in the top 16 here or there, so I will comment on the existence of it, and that was toward the later stages of the format when those cards were released. In terms of the side deck, so in the last time we profiled Lightsworns, I had Shiny Lexi, and I'm going to incorporate it again. It just lines up really well against all these synchro-based strategies, and obviously when we're milling so much, having a free destruction of a synchro monster special summon in the graveyard can be huge. 2 copies of Kaiku. This card was incredibly common when you started to see these zombie-based strategies because it stopped your opponent from utilizing Mizuki, which was one of their better cards. It technically also stopped your opponent from using Necrogardener. You could summon it against Lightsworns, and now your opponent can't Necrogardener you, and you can start picking away Lightsworn names. So it actually had utility in multiple aspects of the format. You wouldn't consider really doing it, but you could technically get rid of value with the 2, but not super common to consider doing that just yet per se, but it is technically something else that this card could do. We had 2 copies of Tragodia. Tragodia is actually a 3, and a lot of people elected to play 3 in some decks, but I elected here to play 2 just as a side deck inclusion. It's a dark monster, so it works well with some of those dark cards, but it was one of the cards that allowed you to play a little bit more of a passive strategy. You're going to notice that some of the cards, and even the main deck traps, kind of trend towards being a little bit more passive than you might anticipate, something like a Lightsworn control strategy. We have 2 copies of Lightning Vortex. This is one of the most common side deck cards in the entire format. Some of these matchups can really bog down where your opponent just has a bunch of recruiters. I'm talking about cards like Pyramid Turtle, Mystic Tomato. Sometimes your opponent has Royal Oppression. It also can create a game state where your opponent's just sitting there with recruiters with Oppression face up. Well, this is one of the cards that can just obviously crack the field, and then even if your opponent has Oppression up, you can establish the attack threshold on the board, and then actually maybe potentially win the game, even if your opponent's Oppression is up. It's one of the cards that allows you to kind of break Lightsworn fields too when you don't necessarily have Judgment Dragon. If your opponent has one of those more aggressive opening plays and gets a bunch of Wolves and Luminas going, it is a pretty valuable card. It's also an out to Archlord Christia, which occasionally you would counter that in Lightsworn. Sometimes people only played 1, so you're not necessarily citing it for that singleton copy. You know, some people just quote-unquote teched a Archlord Christia because it combined really well with Beckoning Light, and you can manipulate your fairy count really well. But it does give you technically an out to that if you decide to side it in against that strategy. Copy of MST that combines with the 2 copies of Dust Tornado. We are afraid of Royal Oppression. We are afraid of strategies like Black Wings and Gladiator Beasts, which is also why we have 3 copies of Royal Decree. And like I mentioned, we can side into a pretty good control-based type strategy here when we're having cards like MST, Tragodia, even Kaiku, depending on the matchup. And then 1 copy of Mirror Force that goes along with that idea of playing a little bit more of a passive strategy. Playing cards like Mirror Force with Kaiku can be pretty powerful. There is a little bit of an issue, and by looking at the format and looking back at some of the deck lists, especially now that you see it like this, I would argue that there's a degree to which there might be a bit of oversighting by some of the players because you do still need to, use your deck for what it's intended to be used for. And you're already cutting so many names of the Lightsworns, you're not necessarily playing enough of the dedicated Lightsworn deck. So when you side deck, it might be difficult. Though there are cards like Burial that you could side out that aren't necessarily all that consequential. So there is an ability to side a quantity of these cards in, but I'm not necessarily in favor of siding in, 10 of these cards in a matchup per se. But it does give you a wide range of cards to counteract some of the most popular things in the format. But nevertheless, that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.